She went from public humiliation to a mafia villa before sunset. That morning, Elena was picking vegetables off the cobblestones while her ex-husband laughed at her in front of strangers. By night, she was inside Dante Alighieri's Renaissance estate, sleeping in his mother's old room, carrying his twins, and being treated like the most precious woman in Florence. But stepping into his protection is also meant stepping into a world where gossip, enemies, and ex-fiancés would come for her next. Let us open this psychological case file. The visual evidence presents a sunlit street in Florence, but the clinical reality is a profound trauma response unfolding in real time. We observe Elena, a subject actively fracturing under the public humiliation inflicted by her ex-husband. Notice her hypervigilance as her groceries scatter across the cobblestones. The tourists are merely environmental noise, blind to the coercive control previously established by her abuser. Yet, there is an unseen variable. She carries twins, and observing from the alleyway is the biological father, an apex predator operating within an organized crime syndicate. Here is a clinical lesson for us all. Never corner a seemingly defenseless subject, because you cannot calculate the dangerous protective forces lurking in their psychological periphery. We must examine her dissociative tunneling. Her ocular focus is rigidly fixed on Marco, the primary aggressor. Clinically speaking, this man spent 5 years systematically dismantling her neural pathways through textbook emotional subjugation. She managed 3 months of cognitive rehabilitation, only to have her nervous systems severely triggered today. Marco projects his void, utilizing public humiliation to re-establish dominance. He is accompanied by a new female subject, acting merely as fresh narcissistic supply. Let this serve as a foundational psychological reminder. A pathological abuser consistently requires a new distraction to mask their own deeply rooted inferiority complex. Marco smiles, completely blind to the lethal variables he is currently activating in the shadows. You and I must analyze the clinical cruelty embedded in this specific frame. The woman clinging to his arm is Alacia, the precise variable Marco concealed during the dissolution of their marriage. He utilizes a sharp laugh, a classic deflection mechanism, mocking her panic to elevate his own fragile ego. He performs the role of the victimized partner for the audience, manipulating bystanders into recording her breakdown. As he approaches, the olfactory trigger of his cologne activates her cellular memory of his past violence. It is a textbook conditioning response. Always remember this verified behavioral truth. The loudest individual in any environment is statistically the weakest net, projecting immense volume solely to disguise their own overwhelming guilt and structural decay. Observe her physiological response as Marco targets her remaining self-esteem. He degrades her appearance, utilizing verbal strikes that register as absolute neurological trauma. Elena instinctively assumes a defensive posture over her abdomen. She is exactly 30 weeks into gestation. The bystanders cannot identify the biological data she protects. Marco categorizes her as pathetic, while his new supply mirrors his cruelty. He publicly frames their divorce as his personal liberation. Elena searches his microexpressions for the empathy she once perceived, but his pathology is total. Here is a clinical lesson to prevent chronic emotional suffering. When a subject demonstrates their baseline pathology, believe the behavioral data the very first time. The environmental stimuli shift drastically as Marco escalates his verbal assault, demonstrating the severe lack of impulse control typical of a megalomaniac. Before another destructive vocalization occurs, A low-frequency auditory interruption paralyzes the scene. The civilians instinctively lower their devices in response to the sudden threat level. Elena registers the acoustic signature of her hidden partner. Dante Valieri emerges from the peripheral shadows. He exhibits the calculated predatory motor function of a highly organized kingpin. Note this psychological reality. Sometimes the universe introduces an incredibly dangerous variable to serve as a necessary protective barrier when your own internal defenses have entirely collapsed. The clinical focus must now shift to Dante. He organically alters the atmospheric pressure of a room through sheer behavioral dominance. His ocular response is entirely devoid of warmth, registering as a dead void in the natural sunlight. It is this unadulterated projection of power that forces the civilians to retreat. Elena experiences acute tachycardia. Marco, rendered completely blind by his own narcissistic inflation, aggressively commands Dante to withdraw. Dante merely adjusts his cranial angle, producing a slow, terrifying smirk. It is the exact micro-expression a predator displays before a kill. Let this serve as a critical diagnostic warning. Unchecked arrogance will permanently blind a subject to the absolute danger standing right in front of them. Marco produces an unregulated laugh, challenging the interloper. He categorizes Elena as damaged goods, displaying the profound lack of empathy characteristic of a narcissistic personality. We have documented the specific brand of cruelty in the clinical literature. Elena closes her eyes, exhibiting an avoidance mechanism. When she re-engages, Dante is not projecting pity. His focus is locked onto Marco, with a cold mathematical calculation for destruction. His tone drops to a lethal frequency as he inquires about the exact duration of their marriage. Process this clinical observation carefully. A securely attached partner will always accurately assess your inherent value, precisely when your former abuser has aggressively convinced you that you possess entirely none. Marco inflates his posture, declaring it was 5 years, entirely oblivious to the psychological trap activating around him. Dante systematically dissects that fragile ego, exposing the subject's pathology. He clinically lists the chronic infidelity, the financial hemorrhaging from gambling, and the emotional starvation utilized to mask Marco's insecurities. The environment abruptly silences. Marco experiences rapid vasodilation, flushing crimson under the shock of exposure. He recoils as Dante advances one step. Dante diagnoses him as a fundamentally weak boy, hiding inside an adult structure. Record this data point. A subject's carefully concealed destructive behaviors are never isolated, and the psychological debt will always eventually demand payment. Observe the auto-fear response as reality penetrates Marco's cognitive defenses. He is no longer engaging a civilian target. He is making direct eye contact with Dante Valieri, a documented kingpin of the underworld. Marco's vocal cords constrict, producing a submissive apology. Dante evaluates him with absolute clinical detachment. He then introduces the critical variable, inquiring why Marco feels authorized to publicly degrade the mother of his children. The collective respiratory rate of the crowd drops. Elena experiences neurological tremors, processing that her concealed reality is now empirical data. Let this be a sobering diagnostic lesson. An inflated ego should never initiate a psychological confrontation that entirely exceeds its basic survival parameters. The crowd's social dynamic destabilizes. Devices are elevated to capture the anomaly. The untouchable kingpin has voluntarily supplied a massive data point. Focus on his terminology. Children, plural. Marco exhibits temporary paralysis, unable to process the revelation. The threat matrix radiating from Dante is so severe that Marco's new supply instinctively retreats. Marco attempts an irrational confession, but Dante intercepts it. He asserts that Marco's rights were completely nullified upon his initial betrayal. Internalize this clinical principle. If you systematically devalue a loyal subject, time will inevitably expose the exact magnitude of your miscalculation. Dante initiates physical contact, placing a firm, protective hand directly on Elena's lower spine. Let us examine that tactile intervention. The placement on the spine is an aggressive territorial display. Dante maintains ocular dominance over Marco, clinically inquiring what psychological objective this public humiliation was meant to achieve. Marco begins to perspire, his nervous system in full panic. He offers a pathetic rationalization, claiming he would have ceased hostilities had he known Dante claimed her. Dante's expression tightens in absolute disgust. He correctly diagnoses that Marco only regulates his aggression when a more dominant male is present. True psychological stability is measured by how one treats the vulnerable when no immediate threat exists. Elena remains entirely static, her covert existence ruptured, silently signaling her desire for immediate extraction. You and I must observe this behavioral symptoms. Dante applies regulated pressure to Elena's hand, stabilizing her before re-engaging the target. He demands vocalized contrition to counteract the chronic psychological warfare Marco previously employed. Marco, impaired by cognitive dissonance, questions the seriousness of the command. It is a catastrophic miscalculation. Dante lowers his vocal frequency to the register he utilizes when authorizing an execution. He systematically dismantles Marco's external identity. The banking career is terminated. The luxury residence is repossessed. The vehicle is liquidated. Absorb this fundamental truth. You can never successfully construct a stable identity upon the foundation of another person's trauma. The psychological ledger will always demand absolute balance. The streetlights illuminate Marco as his fragile psychology collapses. Dante lowers his voice, employing the ultimate manipulation of an apex predator. He promises to reduce Marco's car to scrap. Observe the somatic response. Color drains from Marco's face, his partner retreating from the sheer gravity of a true megalomaniac asserting dominance. Marco attempts a final defiance, but Dante clinically severs it. Apologize or be eradicated. Elena observes her former tormentor short-circuit a psychiatric study in vanity warring with the raw instinct for survival. He chokes out the surrender. The clinical truth remains absolute. An unchecked ego is a silent countdown to ruin. Swallow your pride willingly, or the environment will violently force it down your throat. Forcing the apology mirrors the agony of pulling glass from a wound. Dante offers zero therapeutic mercy, demanding every ugly detail. Trembling, Marco lists his behavioral sins. He admits to breaking her self-worth, the infidelity, and the theft. His voice shatters under sudden cognitive dissonance. Elena stands in the shadows, exhibiting complete emotional numbness. She spent months begging for this validation, but hearing it registers as hollow static. Take this clinical observation to heart. Sometimes the closure you prayed for offers zero actual healing. It merely proves you have outgrown the parasite who broke you. Dante applies one final pressure point, forcing Marco to confess she deserved better. The street goes dead silent, and Elena swallows back a single tear. Let us examine this behavioral shift together. We are witnessing the exact moment the power dynamic inverts. Elena is done bleeding for a subject incapable of perceiving her value. With detached grace, she accepts his apology. That is the true psychological victory. Absolute indifference. Dante steps closer, lacing his fingers through hers in an undeniable, possessive claim. He issues a chilling promise. If her name ever crosses Marco's lips again, Dante will dismantle his existence. Marco nods frantically, raw terror in his pupils, before scrambling into the dark. Bystanders capture every microsecond on their phones. Let this be your lesson. The most elegant revenge is elevating your own baseline reality. Starve toxic subjects of your energy and watch them fade to absolute nothingness. The crowd scatters, and the terrifying aura of the boss dissolves. Dante's features soften into raw concern as he assesses her psychological state. Elena emits a fragile laugh, her chest tight with residual cortisol. His thumb traces rhythmic circles against her knuckles, a somatic grounding technique. He admits he never intended to drag their bond into the public domain. But observing that inferior specimen belittle her ignited an instinct he could not suppress. Her safe, invisible existence has been permanently deleted. Here is a vital, clinical truth. A genuine protector will always shield you from external trauma, even if it forces them to sabotage their own carefully constructed parameters. Dante studies her face, whispering that it is time to expose every hidden variable. Elena offers a slow nod. The streets are populated with assessing eyes. Dante presents a choice: her apartment or fortified compound. The estate is far more than a residence. It is a fortress of cold marble and intimidating dominance, perfectly mirroring the psychological profile of the man himself. Elena selects the compound. He guides her to the vehicle, his grip acting as a physical anchor. Her prefrontal cortex is a violent blur. In 15 minutes, her carefully guarded coping mechanisms were shredded. The data is public. He claimed her and their unborn heirs for the city to witness. Take this psychological lesson to heart. Sometimes the safe parameters you desperately cling to must shatter completely, just so you can finally adapt to the profound reality waiting for you. Observe how Elena clinically assesses the figure beside her. He maintains intense physical proximity, triggering a severe cognitive dissonance. She questions if being claimed by an apex predator is a pathology or a twisted salvation. They enter a waiting black sedan. When the reinforced doors engage, external stimuli vanish into pure acoustic isolation. Dante activates the privacy partition, sealing them in an intimate vacuum. His consuming gaze locks onto hers, analyzing the frantic fluctuations of her panic. He quietly requests her internal monologue. Elena exhales, whispering that in 15 minutes he completely inverted her baseline reality. Here is a stark psychological reminder. The most profound structural transformations in our human experience always strike in the space of a single deafening heartbeat. The lighting catches a micro-expression of regret on Dante's features. He apologizes for the ambush, but leaves zero diagnostic doubt he will never regret establishing his claim. Anxiety restricts Elena's breathing. She dreads the sociological narrative of a civilian trapping a billionaire. Before the cognitive distortion swallows her, Dante's hands frame her face, arresting her physical tremors. His voice is a dominating rumble. He commands her to stop letting a collapsed narcissist like Marco dictate her fundamental worth. Staring into her pupils, he states she possesses the psychological fortitude to bring a monster like him to his knees. Let this be your daily reminder. Never allow the toxic conditioning of a past captor to blind you to the immense, undeniable value you possess today. Stick with me as we dissect the genesis of this attachment, This was a complex psychological enmeshment. Elena reminds him that 4 months prior, she was merely rebuilding her shattered ego after a brutal divorce. Dante bypasses her defensive dialogue. He confesses his primary behavioral drivers were strictly violence and territorial dominance. Then she entered his environment at an art exhibition. For her, an isolation tactic. For him, a profound neurological disruption. He asked her assessment of a canvas, and his violent fixations evaporated. The apex predator was subdued. He perfectly recalls the exact midnight blue shade of her garment. This proves a vital diagnostic point. Authentic integration occurs in microscopic, uncalculated details, long before the conscious mind recognizes the shift. Dante smiles, noting how she introduced regulating stimuli into his desensitized baseline. Elena attempts to deflect, but Dante blocks her conversational escape routes. His fingers map her jaw, categorizing their connection as a physiological anomaly. Suddenly, his nervous system spikes as Marco's profile resurfaces. Processing the trauma that inferior male inflicted, Dante's jaw contracts violently. He possessed the authority to terminate Marco's biological functions. The singular variable overriding that lethal impulse was Elena's preference for nonviolence. She required a stable environment to heal. This demonstrates a vital clinical truth. Exhibiting calculated restraint demands exponentially more cognitive endurance than simply executing a lethal command. For her stabilization, the predator chose absolute mercy. Suppressing his aggressive programming was a neurological sacrifice. Processing Marco's disrespect triggered a systemic override. A subject conditioned by violence cannot ignore a territorial threat. Elena regulates her respiration, asking the critical query, what is their status now? The syndicate knows she carries his successors. Dante secures her hand, transmitting an unbreakable behavioral contract. He admits the exposure was an impulse control failure, yet registers zero remorse. She is the nucleus of his reality. He swears to function as her shield, but it dictates that the next phase is governed entirely by her executive function. Document this clinical metric. Authentic power is never about constructing a secure enclosure. It is about willingly transferring the access codes and granting the subject absolute autonomy. Watch closely. This is where the sociopathic armor fractures. Dante transfers her coordinates into her jurisdiction. Elena's defense mechanism was hyper-independence, but observing this dominant male dismantle her abuser, Rusa reorganized her neural pathways. She requires her offspring conditioned in a regulated environment, isolated from her toxic past. She questions if an organism forged in violence can manufacture a secure habitat. The vulnerability is staggering. Scanning his eyes, she whispers his behavioral patterns already have. For months, his stimuli made her feel structurally irreplaceable. Analyze this therapeutic truth. A symbiotic partnership requires mutual psychological elevation. It is irrelevant what dominant crowns you wear externally. What matters is how you handle each other's trauma in the dark. Dante rotates toward her. His vocal frequency is a stabilizing hum. He assures her that her environmental parameters will now supersede his megalomaniacal ambitions. Beyond the glass, the perimeter gates of his fortified compound separate. We are analyzing centuries of heavy, fortified masonry. As the transport halts, a cognitive shift registers in Elena's cortex. This high-security installation could function as her permanent baseline habitat. The calculation is terrifying, yet floods her system with an intoxicating dopamine hit. Dante exits into the cool atmosphere, extending a physical anchor to initiate total environmental lockdown. Here is the final clinical mandate. Achieving true homeostasis often requires walking off the charted edges of your psychological map, stepping directly into the dark void to successfully locate your optimal biological coordinates. Observe the architectural isolation. The heavy iron gates close, severing Elena from the external stimuli of the chaotic city. Dante brings her into his innermost sanctum, a room saturated with the olfactory triggers of old paper and leather. Clinically speaking, this is the classic grooming phase of the megalomaniac narcissist. He presents an illusion of raw vulnerability, feeding her, treating her like absolute royalty. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case file together. Notice how the predator disarms the prey by exposing his soft underbelly. It is a brilliant, chilling manipulation. We often confuse isolation with safety. The lesson here is simple. Be careful when someone offers you absolute sanctuary from the world, because the ultimate price is usually your complete dependence on them. Physically decompresses into the heavy leather chair. She is exhibiting an acute stress response, clutching her abdomen where 2 fetal heartbeats reside. Dante observes from the threshold. Look at his behavioral shift. The hardened enforcer suddenly mimics tenderness, validating her maternal instinct to shield her unborn twins from her erratic former partner. He recognizes her trauma and immediately positions himself as the superior protector. This is the bedrock of what we call trauma bonding. He leverages her previous abuse to cement his own psychological dominance. It is a masterful, haunting strategy to watch unfold. There is simple, grounded reality to extract from this dynamic. The deepest protective instincts of a mother are primal, but we must always ensure the person validating those instincts is not just building a newer, gilded cage. The psychological pressure finally breaches her defenses. Elena vocalizes her central anxiety. She confesses she has been hiding the pregnancy for 3 weeks, terrified of anchoring her unborn children to a violent criminal syndicate. Here is where the clinical diagnosis of the megalomaniac narcissist becomes undeniable. Dante does not offer comforting platitudes. He looks her in the eye and weaponizes total honesty. He openly admits the lethal nature of his reality, then swiftly pledges his private army to her defense. By exposing the danger, he effectively neutralizes her fear of it. It is a highly effective cognitive override. The takeaway for our own lives is fascinating. Radical transparency is the most powerful tool for building trust, even if the truth you are sharing is profoundly dark and deeply uncomfortable. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Dante effectively places his entire illicit empire at her feet. When Elena expresses a desire for a statistically normal existence, he clinically deconstructs the illusion of normalcy. He reminds her that settling for a predictable life is exactly what tethered her to a chronically toxic marriage. This is textbook psychological rewiring. He offers absolute financial autonomy and impenetrable security, replacing her chaotic past with his structured, violent reality. She is being seamlessly conditioned to accept him as her sole provider and savior. It forces us to re-examine our own behavioral patterns. Sometimes the safe, predictable choices we make are the very mechanisms that slowly destroy our spirit. We must learn to recognize when safety is just another word for captivity. The temporal pacing of this interaction accelerates rapidly. Dante cites his dark, primal intuition as the mechanism for his survival, and he applies that same lethal certainty to her. He declares his intention for permanence, but observe his absolute psychological mastery here. He hands her the illusion of autonomy. He states she can leave for a guest suite or co-rule his empire. The choice is supposedly hers. Elena gazes at the apex predator who just neutralized her abuser, and she interprets his maneuver as profound emotional vulnerability. The trauma bond solidifies. She perceives a soul beneath the sociopathy. It is a beautifully tragic cognitive distortion. The quiet lesson here remains profoundly relevant. Real strength does not require physical intimidation. The greatest power often lies in having the courage to stand unarmed before another human being. The paradox of this case study is striking. The sociopathic kingpin is exhibiting genuine physiological signs of abandonment anxiety. He is terrified this fragile woman will reject his parameters. But Elena is already fundamentally rewired. Flight is no longer her default trauma response. Her previous partner engaged in systematic identity erasure, but Dante actively catalogues her behavioral nuances. He validates her intellect. When he asks for her final consent, she surrenders to the gamble, interpreting his obsession as deep romantic validation. His neurological relief is visible, a profound physical reaction in real time. We are witnessing the total genesis of her capitulation. Let this be a practical reminder for your own trajectory. Never allow the ghosts of past psychological abuse to convince you to accept a smaller, quieter version of your own life. Dante initiates physical contact, pulling her into a rigid embrace while hyper-consciously navigating the biological reality of her pregnancy. He vocalizes a binding commitment to validate her surrender. In the external environment, her narcissistic former partner is facing complete social and structural ruin. But Elena exhibits zero empathy for his collapse. Her neurological distress is entirely neutralized. The auditory chaos of her previous life has been replaced by the rhythmic certainty of her new captor. He places a heavily scarred hand over her abdomen, inquiring about the fetal development. She smiles, anchored completely by his lethal gravity. There is a deeply human reality embedded in this dark transition. True, enduring peace is rarely found in the noise of public opinion. It is built in the quiet spaces, guarded by those who protect your boundaries. It is clinically fascinating to observe this apex predator unravel over the abstract concept of new life. His vocal tone drops, saturated with an almost obsessive wonder as he inquires about the biological sex of the twins. When he states he will love them ferociously simply because they share her genetic code, he dismantles her final cognitive barrier. Elena exhales, releasing deeply suppressed maternal anxiety. She articulates her terror of failing these children, of his chaotic world swallowing them whole. Stick with me, because this is where the psychology gets deeply relatable. Most of us have stood on the precipice of intense imposter syndrome. We let silent anxieties dictate our self-worth. But the moment you drag those terrifying internal dialogues out into the open air, you permanently sever their psychological control over you. Analyze his crisis intervention strategy. He does not invalidate her panic. Instead, he normalizes her maternal terror, expertly mirroring her emotions to establish a shared psychological burden. Then, the emotional mirroring abruptly ceases. His affect flattens into the cold, calculated day stare of a megalomaniac narcissist. He issues a definitive blood oath, guaranteeing fatal consequences for any biological organism that threatens their offspring. It is a chilling display of predatory intent, yet Elena feels a rush of safety. This is Stockholm Syndrome perfectly synthesized into romantic devotion. As you analyze this dynamic, take away this simple, grounded standard. You deserve an ally who will patiently hold space for your deepest anxieties and simultaneously stand as an absolute barrier between you and any harm. The environmental tension fragments the moment Maria breaches the perimeter. The matriarchal housekeeper enters bearing complex carbohydrates and herbal tea designed for gestational support. Information flows through a criminal syndicate like a central nervous system. Maria utilizes a softly subversive tone, noting that this sterile compound requires the auditory chaos of children. Elena exhibits a startled response, but Dante displays submissive amusement. He completely delegates his authority to the domestic caretaker, openly accepting her intent to systematically spoil his heirs. He physically directs the caloric intake toward Elena, commanding her to nourish herself. There is a fundamental baseline we must recognize here. Regulating your physical health is the absolute foundation for surviving any profound psychological transition. As her acute sympathetic, nervous response subsides, biological requirements take absolute precedence. Chronic emotional trauma fundamentally depletes the physical vessel. She consumes the meal in silence, while Dante subjects her to an intense, unblinking, observational study, fixated on her like an obsession. The psychological spell shatters when Elena references her corporate parameters, mentioning she must fabricate an illness for her art gallery employment. Dante immediately instructs her to sever that dependency. He interrogates her vocational fulfillment. She quietly admits it only provides baseline survival. You and I are going to look at this together and decide, how often do we voluntarily remain in our own sterile cages simply because the locks are familiar? Dante presents a brutally clear reality. Why merely exist when you finally have the resources to truly live? Observe the subject, Dante, utilizing grand sweeping gestures to bypass Elena's trauma-induced hypervigilance. He proposes an art gallery, an offering devoid of financial restraint, which acts as a classic psychological anchor. Elena, habituated to the chronic psychological warfare of her previous abuser Marco, interprets this sudden safety as a profound threat. Her cognitive dissonance is palpable. Dante swiftly neutralizes her panic, employing a soothing, rhythmic cadence to lower her heart rate, directing her focus entirely toward the gestation of their offspring. The clinical takeaway here is elemental. When a genuine avenue of escape presents itself to a trauma victim, the initial instinct is self-sabotage. One must consciously regulate the nervous system to accept the reprieve. We observe Elena dissecting the structural fractures of the room, a coping mechanism mirroring her fragmented psyche. Dante shatters the silence, deliberately obstructing her return to her former environment. He understands that returning a victim to the locus of their trauma guarantees regression. You and I have analyzed enough case files to recognize the suffocating gravity of a toxic environment. Sometimes, psychological survival demands permanent severance. Her fear of isolation paralyzes her flight response. Upon her compliance, this apex predator exhibits a measurable drop in physiological tension. He extends a scarred hand, a display of dominant protection. Submitting to this calculated dynamic triggers an undeniable dopamine surge through her nervous system. Dante maneuvers her through the echoing acoustics of his compound, a deliberate exhibition of his territorial dominance. They bypass the sterile, shadowy zones of his operation and arrive at a highly restricted quadrant. He opens a heavy door, weaponizing his own vulnerabilities by revealing the preserved sanctuary of his deceased mother. This is a masterful psychological tether. He notes the panoramic views of the Tuscan perimeter, aiming to stabilize her chronic anxiety. The visual stimuli are engineered for pacification. The room is saturated in warm, grounding tones, complete with massive French doors filtering the dying sunlight. From a behavioral standpoint, true peace of mind remains the ultimate neurological luxury, far surpassing any material acquisition. The subject remains immobilized, experiencing neurological shock in response to unexpected benevolence. Dante invalidates her feelings of unworthiness, utilizing physical proximity to assert his psychological footprint. He references their unborn twins, his eyes radiating the possessive aggression typical of a megalomaniac narcissist, securing his lineage. Yet, he exhibits profound impulse control by physically retreating. He recognizes that absolute power is not demonstrated through forceful acquisition, but through the strategic restraint required to let a fractured mind heal. When she expresses raw gratitude for his violent intervention against Marco, Dante absorbs it as pure validation. He cements their psychological bond by swearing eternal, ruthless protection. The sociopathic baseline of his character demands absolute security over his biological assets. After the chamber is sealed, Elena seeks sensory regulation on the balcony, allowing the thermal drop of the Tuscan wind to cool her hyper-aroused state. Below, the urban grid of Florence flickers. She cognitively processes that her former abuser is currently manipulating public perception, yet the physical distance grants her an unprecedented sense of invulnerability. You and I must acknowledge a fundamental clinical truth here. Compressing your own identity to stabilize the fragile ego of a pathological weakling is a tragic squandering of human potential. She places her hands over her abdomen, anchoring her identity to the profound biological bond developing within her. In the sensory deprivation of the night, she verbalizes her reality to her unborn children. She rationalizes her benefactor's lethal tendencies, interpreting his predatory violence as a necessary protective mechanism. This cognitive reframing strongly mirrors the mechanics of Stockholm Syndrome. The housekeeper, functioning as a maternal archetype, enters to deliver garments and unsolicited behavioral analysis. She provides anecdotal evidence of Dante's psychological development, noting his calcification from an adolescent into a ruthless syndicate leader. She insists his affection for Elena bypasses his antisocial conditioning. Clinically speaking, profound emotional attachment frequently burrows deep beneath the most impenetrable, hardened defense mechanisms. The tactile sensation of silk and the complete absence of auditory triggers should theoretically induce a panic state. Based on standard threat assessments, she ought to be catatonic. She has detonated her previous social structure and tethered her survival to an apex criminal. Yet, her neurochemistry defies logic, secreting oxytocin instead of cortisol. This paradoxical warmth is hope. From a developmental standpoint, experiencing total psychological devastation often provides the sterile bedrock necessary to construct a resilient emotional architecture. She surrenders to the belief that this violent individual will supply the tribal loyalty she lacks. As her brainwaves shift into delta sleep, she definitively rejects her internalized victim narrative. Sudden photic stimulation forces her nervous system online. For a microsecond, a blank slate is swiftly followed by a flood of episodic memories. The traumatic confrontation, the alpha male intervention, the sheer geographical scale of her new containment zone. She places a hand on her torso, acknowledging the gestation that has fundamentally rewritten her biological trajectory. The caretaker archetype returns with heavy caloric sustenance, casually mentioning the patriarch has deployed to the urban center for operational duties. one must never forget the stark reality of psychological stability. Absolute peace is rarely a natural, unbothered state. It is a highly guarded luxury, violently extracted by individuals willing to operate within the darkest moral abysses. We observe the subject suspended in a highly curated, artificial sanctuary. The syndicate leader has mandated her physiological relaxation, utilizing the maternal proxy to enforce a strict dietary intake suitable for multiple gestations. She gazes over the territorial expanse, a picture of manufactured serenity. But neurological equilibrium is incredibly fragile. The aggressive vibration of her mobile device shatters the illusion. Dozens of missed connections, a barrage of digital text, a malicious social platform dominates her visual field. Let us examine this clinical data together, shall we? It highlights a brutal paradigm of trauma recovery. Regardless of the impenetrable physical fortress you construct, unresolved phantoms will exploit any fissure to infect your present reality. The digital display illuminates a textbook character assassination campaign. Societal parasites label her a manipulative opportunist, projecting their frustrations onto her reproductive status. They excavate her previous marital trauma to maximize psychological damage. Elena exhibits an immediate autonomic nervous system crash. Severe motor tremors manifest. Her parasympathetic digestion halts entirely. This is the precise collateral damage Dante predicted when merging with a high-profile entity. From a behavioral perspective, chronically unfulfilled individuals will relentlessly attack an elevation in status they lack the capacity to achieve. One must never allow the erratic, projected hostilities of anonymous, hollow entities to calibrate their internal foundational value system. Her startled response activates as the orchestrator materializes. Stripped of formal camouflage, he appears dangerously primal. His threat detection registers her elevated cortisol. He advances, physically confiscating the digital trigger. She attempts a masking protocol with a fabricated smile, but his clinical gaze penetrates the facade. As he processes the vitriol, a chilling, calculated hostility reconfigures his micro-expressions. He returns the device, establishing intense ocular dominance. He dictates that these peripheral antagonists are blind to her true psychological resilience. The clinical truth remains constant. The handful of entities whose evaluations genuinely dictate your survival will inevitably recognize your cognitive worth, regardless of how loud the ignorant collective becomes. Insecurity surfaces as Elena verbalizes her inadequacy against his past acquisitions. A megalomaniac narcissist operates in absolutes. He uses tactile coercion, framing her jaw to force unyielding eye contact. He clinically categorizes the external hostility as mere psychological projection. Her value is absolute simply because his ego selected her. He guarantees that while societal friction is the cost of his reality, any tangible threat will be systematically eradicated. He reinforces her maternal competency to solidify the trauma bond. Let us objectively analyze this mechanism. When a lethal organism forms an impenetrable barrier between you and external predators, that rare, unshakable loyalty becomes the ultimate currency for your long-term psychological survival. Dante exhibits a classic narcissistic inversion, assuring Elena he is the fortunate one. She displays severe anxiety, weeping over rumors that she trapped him. Clinically, Dante delivers a masterclass in psychological framing. He reminds her she was prepared to flee his violent reality. He openly admits his refusal to let her go is the actual cage. Elena then shows clear signs of trauma bonding, smiling as she teases his megalomania. Dante thrives on this, relishing that she does not fear his antisocial pathology. When she confesses her fear of failure, he counters with a calculated vow to choose her through every mistake. The psychological takeaway is simple. A stable connection never demands flawless behavior. It requires a deliberate, daily choice to remain anchored to one another. Let us examine the pathology of this moment together. The quiet garden mirrors Elena processing her new reality. As an apex predator, Dante has no use for a passive dependent. A megalomaniac requires an conditioned to tolerate his dark psyche. Reality soon intrudes, forcing her to clear out her old apartment. Naturally, the kingpin refuses to let her travel without his militant oversight. His armored vehicle glides over the cobblestones, isolating them behind tinted glass. The civilians outside remain completely oblivious to the trauma bonding solidifying within the cabin. Elena senses her identity shifting under his shadow. Here is a vital clinical truth. Stepping directly into a terrifying unknown is often the only way to uncover the one person who is truly capable of catching you. Watch the societal dread bleeding into the streets as civilians freeze, recognizing the predator behind the tinted glass. They arrive at her decaying fourth-floor apartment. Previously, this space offered Elena psychological safety. Now, with a criminal mastermind standing behind her, the room feels suffocating. Her hands tremble as she turns the key, exhibiting somatic shame over her living conditions. Dante steps into the cramped room, holding her existence. Clinically, his reaction is fascinating. His features remain rigid, offering a calculated display of respect rather than debilitating pity. This illustrates a profound behavioral principle. A truly secure partner will never weaponize your past, nor make you feel ashamed of the ruins you survived before they finally arrived. Dante sweeps the room, conducting a behavioral assessment. He notes her resilience in the fractured details. He analyzes the vibrant paintings on the walls. Elena confesses this tiny space was her first taste of freedom after an abusive past. Without hesitation, the megalomaniac offers to buy the entire building to preserve her psychological refuge. His grandiose devotion is staggering. Yet, Elena signals a breakthrough, deciding she is done hiding. She opens her suitcase. In a striking display of cognitive dissonance, the city's most feared predator steps forward, using his lethal hands to softly fold her garments. Authentic dominance is never about crushing a broken spirit. It is the secure capacity to kneel down in the dust and help carry the burden. Stick with me as we examine the rupture of Elena's emotional dam. She whispers they must discuss her ex-husband. Dante freezes, his rigid posture signaling a massive adrenaline spike. He insists she owes him no confessions, but a survivor of abuse desperately needs her reality validated. She sits on the bed, and the kingpin provides his hyperfocus. Elena recounts the classic cycle of a narcissistic parasite. It began with intense love bombing, followed by a rushed marriage. Then, the psychological mask slipped. Coercive and control dripped in through cruel jokes and systematic isolation, severing her from her support networks. The descent into torment is often paved with charming smiles. Never ignore the early red flags before your autonomy is completely erased. Elena's confession reveals a severe process of self-erasure. She dismantled her identity to survive, repressing her ambitions because her abuser saw her talent as a threat. For 5 years, she played the submissive dependent while Marco engaged in financial abuse. The tragic symptom of her trauma was her belief that minimizing her existence would earn his affection. Dante absorbs this data, his jaw locked tightly as he suppresses homicidal ideation. The final fracture occurred upon discovering Marco's infidelity. When confronted, the coward used classic psychological manipulation, shifting the blame entirely onto his traumatized wife. Let this clinical assessment serve as a vital warning. Never allow a deeply disordered individual to dictate the fundamental value of your own humanity. Post-separation, the abuser's conditioning remained active as a destructive inner critic within Elena. Dante processes this trauma data in calculated silence. When the megalomaniac speaks, his tone lacks empathy, replaced by a lethal pragmatism. He states flatly that had he known this yesterday, Marco would have been permanently terminated. Elena exhibits conflict avoidance, confessing she hid the truth to prevent violence. Dante paces, his psychomotor agitation mirroring a caged apex predator. He clinically catalogues the offenses committed against her psyche. He stops, anchoring his gaze onto hers to establish the boundary between erratic vengeance and calculated execution. In a chaotic ecosystem, adopting a monstrous persona is often the only way to shield the vulnerable from destruction. Let us unpack this transition into darkness together. A sociopathic smile carves across Dante's face. He vows not to physically assault her ex-husband. A mastermind possesses far more systematic methods to dismantle a target's existence. Suddenly, Elena's phone pierces the quiet. A frantic journalist invades their sanctum, demanding answers about her pregnancy. An acute panic attack washes over her. She drops the call, but the device relentlessly vibrates. Dante glides forward, confiscating the phone from her trembling hands. He intercepts the next call, his vocal register dropping into a bone-chilling robotic bass line. The behavioral lesson is clear. You must establish unyielding boundaries. Never allow the chaotic interference of the outside world to penetrate the silent fortress of your mental resolve. Dante speaks with the chilling detachment of a sociopath, promising the press that further intrusion will trigger an apocalyptic retaliation. He cuts the connection. Elena enters severe hyperventilation, insisting he cannot fight the media. Dante's gaze locks onto her with pathological certainty as he whispers his directive, "Watch me." He uses an anchoring technique, declaring she is under his absolute jurisdiction. Yet the destruction of her anonymity induces claustrophobia. Desperate for sensory regulation, she begs to go outside. Minutes later, they navigate the mist-shrouded river. His heavy hand rests on her spine, acting as a somatic tether to stabilize her nervous system. When catastrophic anxiety strikes, a single regulated presence is often all it takes to survive the wreckage. Let us clinically evaluate this psychological crossroad. Elena collapses on a bench, her brain short-circuiting under cognitive overload. Hours ago, she was a ghost. Now, she carries the airs of Dante Volova, an underworld apex predator. Her identity is violently dissected by the public. Dante sits beside her, utilizing his mass to block the wind. As a pragmatic megalomaniac, he offers no sugar-coated cognitive distortions. Staring into her dilated pupils, he forces radical acceptance, pronouncing her quiet life deceased. From those psychological ashes, he constructs a new paradigm, vowing to establish an impenetrable behavioral fortress so she never processes trauma alone again. Hold tightly to this truth. A grounded reality will always protect your psyche far better than the fragile comfort of a pretty lie. Anticipatory anxiety crashes over them. Elena watches a distant stroller, the cognitive dissonance of her reality leaving her breathless. She is gestating twins for a calculating architect of violence. She turns to the untouchable commander of this empire, asking a simple question: is he afraid? In a rare deviation from his pathology, the megalomaniac drops his defensive mask. He confesses to suffering from acute terror. Conditioned in an environment where vulnerability equals death, he possesses no blueprints for fatherhood that do not involve forging children into weapons. Elena laces her fingers through his scarred hands, using physical touch to regulate his panic. She offers a profound cognitive reframe. None of us possess a perfect developmental map. We are all just terrified minds, fumbling through the dark together. Today, you and I are going to unpack a rather fascinating clinical anomaly together. We observe an apex predator displaying radical submission. Dante, a man whose hands have routinely crushed human windpipes, now bows in utter reverence, pressing a lingering kiss to Elena's trembling knuckles. He is mesmerized by her psychological resilience. Elena deploys humor as a defense mechanism, noting that global humiliation and a mafia ambush accelerate human evolution. Her remark triggers a violent, genuine laugh from the syndicate boss. It is a sound so chilling that pedestrians freeze in primal terror, sensing a predator in their midst. Yet Elena maintains unbroken eye contact, entirely desensitized to the danger. The clinical takeaway is clear. When a captor proves willing to shed blood for their subject, the external world simply ceases to exist. In the pathology of organized crime, peace is merely a temporary suspension of violence. We can observe the physiological shift in Elena as the ambient light catches the blood draining from her face. Dante is preparing to introduce her to the syndicate hierarchy. This includes his sister Chiara and his uncle Roberto, individuals driven by severe paranoia and tribal loyalty to mafia bloodlines. Dante outlines the clinical reality with sociopathic calm. His relatives will classify Elena as a critical vulnerability, a foreign pathogen threatening the syndicate organism. Assimilating into a sociopathic unit requires extreme psychological armor. The subject must prove she cannot be broken by intimidation. If we study devotion in these high-stress environments, we see that loyalty is proven only by walking willingly into immense psychological crossfire. Look closely at the autonomic nervous system response in Elena's hands. The tremors and shallow breathing are textbook indicators of acute panic brought on by severe environmental displacement. Yet Dante remains entirely static. He uses intense, sustained eye contact to regulate her hyperventilation, operating as her psychological anchor. With the absolute certainty of a megalomaniacal narcissist, he calmly promises to annihilate anyone who challenges her status. He then extracts her to the controlled environment of his sprawling villa. Here, we witness an extreme behavioral pivot. The syndicate executioner mimics the mannerisms of a typical, infatuated partner, leading her through the quiet corridors. A stabilizing figure in any relationship will construct a fortress for your mental health, even if it means orchestrating violence against their own kin. The heavy iron gates secure the perimeter, creating an isolated environment. Carlo provides a lavish meal on the terrace, a calculated attempt to simulate domestic normalcy. But the pathology of syndicate leadership demands constant vigilance. A sudden phone call acts as an auditory trigger, instantly pulling Dante back into his dominant, aggressive state and leaving Elena in isolation. In moments of acute stress, subjects often seek digital dissociation. Instead, Elena exhibits remarkable emotional regulation. She rejects the artificial stimulation of her device and begins pacing the expansive architecture of the estate. She uses the visual stimuli of ancient cellars and indoor gardens to ground herself in the present moment. True cognitive relief is achieved not by distraction, but by actively silencing external chaos. and anchoring oneself in immediate physical tranquility, wanders the perimeter until she discovers a spacious manifestation of arrested trauma. The room contains an antique crib draped in heavy sheets, operating as a shrine to a neglected childhood. Dante enters the space with atypical silence, presenting a stark contrast to his usual dominance. He admits this nursery has remained untouched for 30 years. We are observing a highly dangerous, antisocial individual completely paralyzed by early developmental wounds. He is staring at the exact coordinates where his innocence was terminated. However, the presence of his new fixation, Elena, interrupts the trauma loop. He immediately states his intent to demolish the room entirely to construct a new nursery. Psychological recovery often requires destroying the physical or mental spaces where old trauma resides, allowing new neural pathways and experiences to take root. Dante proposes constructing separate quarters, projecting his own normalized childhood isolation onto his future offspring. Elena immediately rejects this parameter. She insists the twins cohabit the space, actively intervening to prevent the transmission of intergenerational trauma. She refuses to let them experience the severe emotional deprivation Dante survived. At this intervention, we witness a total collapse of Dante's psychopathic defenses. The rigid posture and emotional blunting vanish. Ocular tearing occurs as he makes a binding, obsessive commitment that their children will never experience attachment insecurity. It is a fascinating clinical disintegration of a heavily armored ego, the most effective method for neutralizing the toxic effects of a damaging upbringing is to consciously engineer a radically different environment for the next generation. Let us examine this transition together, as it perfectly illustrates the hypervigilance of a criminal mind. Dante is in a state of rare emotional exposure, verbalizing his deep attachment. Suddenly, the acoustic trigger of an unauthorized vehicle breaching the perimeter shatters the moment. In a microsecond, the vulnerable partner is entirely overridden by the lethal enforcer. His posture rigidifies, his empathy circuits shut down. He issues a direct, commanding order for Elena to isolate herself in the nursery. But observe her behavioral evolution. Rather than displaying a submission response, she directly defies his directive. She moves to the observation point, demanding visual confirmation of the threat. A state of calm is simply a statistical anomaly in a high-risk environment. When danger presents itself, the healthiest response is to face the threat directly with wide-open eyes. The intrusive vehicle in the courtyard serves as a jarring visual disruption to their controlled environment. A woman exits, displaying the unmistakable kinesics of narcissistic entitlement. Wrapped in expensive silk, she approaches the structures with aggressive ownership, her footfalls telegraphing an absolute lack of boundaries. From her elevated vantage point, Elena experiences an immediate somatic drop in her stomach, a clear physiological warning. When she questions the subject's identity, Dante undergoes a rapid stress response. His facial muscles lock, and his pupils dilate as he identifies the intruder. Victoria Castellano, the former partner, she has breached the perimeter to initiate targeted psychological warfare. It is a fundamental truth of human behavior that unresolved conflicts from our history will inevitably surface to test the structural integrity of our current boundaries. The atmospheric tension in the room spikes immediately. Dante exhibits flat affect, a chilling detachment, as he recounts the violent termination of his previous relationship. Victoria has flagrantly violated a direct territorial prohibition. Elena's heart rate accelerates, and her immediate instinct is the flight response she offers to remain concealed. Dante rejects this coping mechanism with absolute finality. His protective instincts activate as he establishes Elena's dominance in the territorial hierarchy, asserting she is the mother of his heirs and cannot be hidden. Downstairs, the physical barrier is breached. Victoria projects her voice through the foyer, demanding engagement with the aggressive entitlement of a cluster B personality. One must never allow the disruptive, chaotic energy of an external figure to force them into a subordinate position within their own primary environment. Dante establishes physical tethering, gripping Elena's hand to solidify their unified front against the incoming psychological assault. As they descend the staircase, we observe Victoria demonstrating dominant posturing in the foyer. The visual confirmation of their physical bond triggers an immediate narcissistic injury in Victoria. She launches a verbal devaluation campaign, weaponizing Elena's socioeconomic status and the pregnancy, framing it as a predatory entrapment. This is a highly calculated maneuver designed to destabilize Elena's self-worth. Dante's response is an icy, flat-toned directive for her immediate extraction. Yet Victoria remains unaffected, feigning casual intent to mask her hostility. Individuals suffering from profound internal deficits will consistently attempt to devalue their targets to regulate their own unstable self-esteem. Do not engage their distorted reality. Victoria performs a slow, deliberate visual assessment of Elena, using sarcastic applause to maximize the induction of shame. The sudden rush of blood to Elena's face indicates a sharp spike in humiliation. Before Elena can verbally defend herself, Dante physically intercepts the line of sight. Interposing his body as a barrier, he issues a severe, low-frequency verbal threat regarding her tone. Unfazed, Victoria presses deeper into the territory. She identifies a specific visual vulnerability, the absence of a commitment ring, and broadcasts it loudly. She is a behavioral predator, isolating a perceived weakness. This provokes a volatile outburst from Dante, who violently reasserts his boundary. Malignant personalities are exceptionally skilled at scanning for and exploiting your deepest insecurities. This highlights the critical necessity of an ally who will aggressively defend your psychological blind spots. You and I are now witnessing a textbook execution of cognitive distortion. Victoria flawlessly pivots to play the victim, mourning the criminal empire they failed to build, and aggressively minimizing her past actions as a minor error. Dante instantly dismantles her fabricated narrative. He coldly states the empirical fact of her betrayal. She engaged in intercourse with his business partner in his primary residence. Elena is temporarily paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the woman. Victoria exhibits zero remorse, merely rolling her eyes and labeling his boundary as pathological rigidity. She then redirects her hostility toward Elena, questioning the survival capacity of a fragile outsider in a sociopathic environment. Dante reaches his absolute threshold, demanding her true motive when a subject casually minimizes an act of profound betrayal. You are observing an incurable lack of empathy. Sever contact permanently. The atmospheric pressure of the room shifts dramatically, offering a textbook study in power displacement. Victoria exhibits the acute panic of a displaced apex predator, projecting the Syndicate S anxiety over Dante S perceived cognitive decline. They view his attachment to a civilian as a catastrophic anomaly. But let us examine this fascinating behavioral shift together. Elena bypasses Dante entirely, confronting Victoria S. megalomaniacal narcissism head-on. accurately diagnosing her as a discarded attachment. Victoria S. resulting laughter is a classic defense mechanism, attacking Elena S. core insecurities regarding her lack of systemic value. It is a calculated, brutal psychological strike, yet, clinically speaking, it highlights a profound human reality. Those who secretly fear your dormant psychological resilience will inevitably target your deepest vulnerabilities simply to trigger a collapse. The ambient tension becomes suffocating, simulating the physiological precursor to a trauma response. For a fraction of a second, we observe Elena oscillating on the precipice of a depressive spiral, questioning her utility to a dangerously omnipotent figure. However, an adaptive response ignites within her. She stabilizes. Elena locks onto the gaze of her aggressor and delivers a devastating cognitive counterstrike. She introduces variables this corrupt structure cannot quantify: unfiltered transparency and a bleeding, radical loyalty. With measured, deliberate articulation, she deconstructs Victoria's fragile psychological architecture built solely on illicit capital. The resulting silence is highly analytical, reinforcing a critical baseline. Genuine self-actualization is never derived from a financial portfolio, but from the absolute refusal to let external hostility extinguish your internal validity. The spatial dimensions of the architecture suddenly induce claustrophobia. Elena maintains her dominant posture, stating she would immediately terminate the attachment if Dante required a purely transactional dynamic. Observe the precise micro-expressions when Victoria processes her systemic defeat. Initiating a hysterical panic response, she interrogates Dante's willingness to incinerate his generational empire. Dante's physiological baseline remains utterly undisturbed, mirroring the affective empathy deficit of a stone monolith. He systematically recalibrates his operational focus, designating Elena as his sole imperative. Victoria's psychological framework fractures as she professes genuine affection, but Dante accurately diagnoses the cognitive distortion. She was merely addicted to his proximity to apex violence. We must never confuse authentic emotional bonding with a parasitic dependency on the dark authority another individual provides. Dante surgically excises the final fragments of Victoria's delusion. Operating with absolute emotional detachment, he reminds her that her neural responses were exclusively stimulated by his syndicate authority. Victoria attempts a final projection, questioning Elena's immunity to systemic greed. Dante envelops Elena, highlighting a fascinating behavioral paradox. He notes Elena's value was authenticated during her flight response, when she attempted to exile herself to isolate their offspring from his pathological violency. Defeated, Victoria retrieves her fragmented narcissistic shell and issues a warning of catastrophic violence. This leaves us with an undeniable empirical truth. Authentic attachment will voluntarily endure trauma to secure your sanctuary, while counterfeit devotion only mobilizes to protect its own investments. Victoria exhibits hesitation at the perimeter, lingering to deliver a highly toxic behavioral forecast. She hypothesizes that Dante's sociopathic uncle will maneuver him into an inescapable, violent paradox. Dante manifests the immobility of a monolith, completely regulating his nervous system as he establishes a definitive spatial boundary, permanently revoking her access. In that microsecond, Victoria's meticulously constructed mask dissolves. A profound wave of unmedicated grief floods her facial symmetry. She had calculated that time would negate her betrayal, but Dante's absolute effective flattening neutralizes that cognitive distortion. Collecting her shattered ego, She leaves Elena with a clinical warning about the permanence of a hypervigilant man's detachment. Trust operates much like a brittle, crystalline structure. Once the molecular bonds are severed, any attempt to reconstruct the matrix will only result in severe lacerations to your own psyche. The auditory stimulus of the doors locking signals the termination of the acute stressor. The room's oppressive psychological density dissipates. Elena's respiratory rate crashes, her motor control failing as adrenaline reserves plummet. Instantaneously, the apex predator archetype dissolves into a regulated, supportive figure. Dante provides essential somatic stabilization, his hands anchoring her dysregulated nervous system. She emits a fractured vocalization, attempting to process if her confrontation was an act of cognitive resilience or suicidal ideation. Dante's gaze reflects an obsessive fixation as he pulls her against his center of mass, validating her bravery. Confronting the malignant entities occupying your environment induces severe autonomic terror, yet it remains the sole clinical path to permanently emancipating your identity from their darker pathology. You and I are now transitioning into the most critical diagnostic phase of this trauma. Dante bypasses any psychological cushioning, conveying the lethal operational metrics of his uncle Roberto. The patriarch is a textbook Machiavellian who processes human empathy as a terminal vulnerability. We observe Elena's amygdala hijacking her system, somatic panic swelling in her respiratory tract. Her developmental history is a chronic loop of minimizing her psychological footprint to regulate the volatile emotions of abusers. Dante intercepts this dissociative spiral, applying deep pressure therapy to her shoulders. He delivers a mandatory cognitive reframe, commanding her to cease hemorrhaging her energetic resources for hostile observers. It highlights a bleak diagnostic certainty. You can exhaust your entire biological existence attempting to appease the emotional voids of toxic individuals, and they will still clinically observe your asphyxiation without a single change in pulse. The atmospheric pressure of the criminal ecosystem forcefully descends. Dante guides Elena to a seated position, initiating a debrief on the syndicate's structural pathology. Following his father's mortality event, Roberta seized the hierarchical apex, enforcing compliance through a highly detached, psychopathic administrative style. Roberto mandates a strategic alliance with an established dynasty, not a trauma-bonded connection with a civilian survivor. Dante's radical prioritization of Elena has fundamentally destabilized the organization's social equilibrium. Consequently, the patriarch has initiated a formal tribunal. They intend to subject Elena to a brutal psychological cross-examination to quantify her exact statistical utility in capital and collateral. It is a grotesque behavioral assessment. You must never permit another entity to process your existence as a depreciating asset on an actuarial table. Your intrinsic emotional validity is completely exempt from their dark market negotiations. Dante's micro-expressions rigidify, validating her paranoid ideations. Within the Uncle's pathological framework, a functioning limbic system is classified as a critical operational flaw. The syndicate systematically exterminates non-transactional attachments. Assessing Roberto's marital history, Dante notes an absence of observable affective data, rendering it indistinguishable from a corporate merger. Conversely, his own parents cultivated a profoundly anomalous psychological sanctuary amidst the systemic violence. His father experienced genuine emotional resonance. Therefore, the sudden biological cessation of his mother fundamentally dismantled the supreme leader's cognitive architecture. Dante articulates this trauma with a flattened affect, projecting the dissociative compartmentalization of an adolescent who entombed his distress at 14. The most aggressively fortified behavioral profiles you analyze are invariably barricading the most catastrophic, unhealed psychological lacerations. During the 5-year period post-bereavement, Dante observed his primary caretaker regress into clinical dissociation. The autopsy listed cardiac arrest, but an analyst recognizes textbook Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, a neurobiological fracturing from profound grief. Shifting his focus, Dante details the maladaptive defense mechanisms engineered from that trauma. He encoded attachment as a strategic vulnerability, viewing emotional surrender as arming a hostile combatant. He dedicated his lifespan to constructing cognitive barricades to circumvent a parallel psychological collapse. Yet, Dante redirects his visual tracking back to Elena, exhibiting a vocal softening that indicates a therapeutic breakthrough. He finally processes his father's willingness to endure the catastrophic risk. Hyper-vigilant isolation protocols effectively neutralize external emotional threats, but they simultaneously incarcerate the subject within agonizing solitary confinement. We observe the subject actively dismantling his traumatic shielding, displaying the emotional contusions he meticulously suppresses. This progression is violently interrupted by percussive stimuli against the oak threshold, a subordinate signals that the sociopathic patriarch has breached the communication network. In a millisecond, the vulnerable neurobiology is terminated, and the psychopathic executive persona is rebooted. The interrogative timeline has been aggressively compressed. Dante deploys to intercept the systemic conflict, leaving Elena without a regulatory anchor in the expansive architecture. Displaying classic self-soothing behavior, she migrates toward his private archival space. The sensory insulation of decaying literature provides a temporary neurological sanctuary. When an uncontrolled crisis detonates within your reality, it is a biological imperative to locate an isolated perimeter and manually regulate your nervous system before the primary shockwave impacts. Navigating the low visibility perimeter, Elena initiates tactile exploration of a marginalized storage unit. These are not forensic ledgers documenting illicit transactions. They are degraded juvenile literature psychological artifacts from a developmental phase preceding his absolute emotional compartmentalization. She extracts a compromised volume, uncovering a handwritten inscription featuring undeveloped motor control. The juvenile iteration of the boss documented his mother's commitment to preserving a space for unregulated expression. A severe empathetic response triggers in Elena, conceptualizing the lethal enforcer as a hyper-vigilant child dependent on maternal validation. Without warning, an auditory emission originates from the shadows. Dante verbally concedes that those deteriorating pages functioned as his sole cognitive refuge. Regardless of the impenetrable, psychopathic exterior and individual projects, a profoundly traumatized internal child constantly monitors the perimeter from the darkest psychological recesses. Watch closely, for you and I are analyzing the psychological core of this subject. The Elena watches as Dante steps into the dim library. The sociopathic mask of the underworld boss has dissolved. He stares at the torn pages, displaying rare vulnerability. He details how his dying mother read to him, enduring agony to shield his developmental years. After her death, the silence became a traumatic trigger. He compulsively preserved her books, defying his father's narcissistic demand to burn his attachments. Dante shuts the decaying binding, his focus locking onto hers. He admits he was awaiting the proper stimulus to shatter his repression. Never discard the traumatic fragments of your formative years. They frequently act as the subconscious compass, guiding your future behavioral baseline. We observe a profound psychological paradox. Dante, a violent syndicate boss, modulates his vocal patterns into animated characters for his unborn twins. It is a textbook trauma response, a desperate attempt to resurrect maternal warmth. This sanctuary implodes the millisecond Elena mentions his uncle. Emotional regulation vanishes from Dante's micro-expressions. Uncle Roberto has aggressively accelerated their confrontation to tonight. This is the preferred tactic of a megalomaniacal narcissist, engineered to induce cognitive overload and exploit physical exhaustion. Always internalize this clinical reality. Manipulators will systematically accelerate your timeline to maintain psychological dominance. Dante sought a stabilization period for his partner, but the predatory cycle has already begun. Dante's rigidity indicates a spike in his nervous system, displaying suppressed homicidal ideation. He identifies the maneuver instantly. An aging narcissist is marking his territorial boundaries. Experiencing adrenal fatigue, Elena collapses into the chair, asking if her existence will remain in this state of hypervigilance. Dante refuses to offer cognitive dissonance. He warns her that this psychological warfare will persist until she demonstrates absolute resilience. Grasping her hands, his pitch drops to a predatory frequency, swearing to eradicate anyone who challenges her status. Survival in a hostile environment rarely requires passive emotional support. It requires a volatile protector who is fully willing to utilize maximum aggression against the psychological predators at the door. Let us dissect this behavioral sequence together, you and I. Dante closes the proximity gap, prioritizing her survival over the syndicate's hierarchy. Elena is paralyzed by clinical anxiety, questioning if her affection places a target on his back. Dante maintains unblinking eye contact, articulating that she provides the sole psychological anchor for his future. If the organization categorizes this attachment as a vulnerability, he accepts the risk. A psychopathic smile alters his symmetry as he promises catastrophic retaliation against anyone misinterpreting his attachment as weakness. Note this diagnostic truth. Authentic psychological fortitude is never achieved through emotional detachment. It is quantified solely by the external threats you are willing to annihilate to protect your humanity. Dante's focus grounds her spiraling cognitive distortions. He issues a strict directive. She must never express remorse for her past trauma. While securing the patriarch's validation offers a survival advantage, Dante establishes an impenetrable boundary. He made a deliberate selection, and no megalomaniac will alter their narrative. A tremor runs down Elena's spine. She notes that simulating dominance in isolation is simple, but the impending dinner constitutes severe psychological warfare. Dante initiates deep pressure therapy by pulling her against his torso, cementing their status as a unified dyad. Here is the clinical definition of human attachment. A structurally sound bond requires entering the stressor environment simultaneously, refusing to let your partner endure the trauma in isolation. Bonding with an apex predator initiates a neurochemical shift within Elena. She survived the psychological destruction orchestrated by her narcissistic ex, neutralizing Victoria in the process. A cognitive restructuring alters her micro-expressions. Enduring an elevated cortisol event with an aging megalomaniac is within her stress tolerance. Projecting stability, She questions Dante regarding the syndicate hierarchy. A fractional relaxation occurs in Dante's facial musculature. He identifies his younger sibling Chiara as the sole genetic anomaly uncorrupted by their family's sociopathic environment. Retain this behavioral metric as you navigate complex hierarchies. You do not require validation from the collective group, only the approval of the subjects critical to your psychological stability. A low frequency emanates from Dante's chest, fracturing the psychological tension. He notes that Chiara exhibited a stimulated response to Elena's arrival, anticipating the disruption of the syndicate's hierarchy. This triggers a serotonin release in Elena, desperate for a sympathetic node in the network. Dante physically redirects her focal point, recalibrating her cognitive framework. She already possesses his absolute loyalty and Maria's devotion. The remaining operatives must adapt or be systematically eliminated. They allocate the subsequent hours to aggressive conversational simulations, neuro-linguistically programming her for the impending psychological warfare. Maintain this operational protocol. When anticipating severe environmental stressors, deliberately manufacture controlled intervals of baseline regulation to prevent psychological fragmentation. During the late circadian cycle, the sensory deprivation of the compound induces hypervigilance. Isolated, Elena checks her device. The interface is saturated with parasocial communications from acquaintances attempting to extract intelligence regarding the region's apex sociopath. Suddenly, a severe psychological stressor is introduced. An encrypted transmission materializes from an untraceable origin point, systematically deconstructing her perceived security and explicitly stating her incompatibility with this hostile network. Observe the physiological markers of panic expanding her pupils. The threat could be Marco, Victoria, or an unidentified syndicate agent. Internalize this behavioral truth. The most devastating psychological trauma is invariably inflicted by faceless, cowardly variables operating from positions of absolute anonymity. Let us examine this clinical matrix together, you and I. Her next choice defines her trauma-bonded arc. Elena suppresses the threat data. Aware Dante is processing the cognitive load of his familial hierarchy. Why introduce a phantom variable to his saturated neural pathways? Dante enters, stripped of his sociopathic armor, displaying biological exhaustion. He inquires if anxiety is preventing her circadian shutdown, inverting her device. Elena interrogates his coping mechanisms for enduring syndicate warfare without experiencing a psychotic break. Dante sits and systematically dismantles his own pathological mythology. He admits that at 19, confronting his father's operatives triggered massive nervous system failure, leaving him paralyzed by terror. Note this psychological lesson. Regardless of the impenetrable mask a subject projects, every apex predator begins as a terrified organism in the dark. Dante administers a cognitive recalibration regarding his uncle. Perfection is a weaponized psychological construct engineered to induce failure. Tomorrow, her sole objective is projecting impenetrable resilience. However, Elena exhibits severe tachycardia, the anonymous variable suffocating her rational processing. She questions his protocol for neutralizing an entity using pathological manipulation to dismantle ego stability. Observe the catastrophic atmospheric shift. The empathetic partner construct dissolves instantly, replaced by the apex criminal architect. His pitch descends into a predatory resonance, demanding identification of the hostile stimulus. She exposes the interface, and homicidal intent floods his pupils as he promises the systematic eradication of the stalker. When a variable proves they are a threat to your psychological stability, accept the data immediately and fiercely protect your mind. Elena engages in a de-escalation protocol, proposing the text is merely a benign anomaly. Dante clinically rejects this psychological illusion. Within his sociopathic paradigm, words are literal munitions. Any organism deploying them against his partner will incur catastrophic consequences. He secures his device, prepared to initiate a scorched earth protocol, simply to regulate her circadian rhythm. Grasping her face, he guarantees the obliteration of any entity attempting to induce psychological inferiority within her. In a standard psychiatric evaluation, this extreme resource guarding constitutes a severe pathological red flag. Yet to a subject whose neural pathways are wired exclusively for toxic betrayal, this possessiveness functions as an impenetrable psychological fortress. Absorb this truth. Authentic loyalty never maintains an observational distance. It demands placing yourself directly into the path of the incoming hostile fire. As Dante coordinates his countermeasures, Elena collapses onto the mattress. The impending day represents a margin between demonstrating apex resilience and catastrophic psychological failure. Placing her hands over her abdomen, she utilizes the twin biological rhythms as a profound mental anchor. To ensure their genetic survival, she will engage any malignant patriarch in combat. The solar cycle breaches the enclosure prematurely, the illumination mocking a sequence that visually codes as an execution. Plagued by stress-induced hallucinations, her restorative sleep was negligible. Suddenly, Maria enters the environment and detonates a devastating cognitive bomb. The confrontation with Roberto has been aggressively accelerated to 11 in the morning. Note this closing clinical takeaway. Regardless of the biological exhaustion paralyzing your nervous system, survival demands extracting yourself from the dark to wage war for your future. Let us open this case file together. Roberto immediately establishes dominance through schedule manipulation. By abruptly shifting their timeline, this megalomaniacal narcissist forces his subjects into acute hypervigilance. It is a textbook psychological power play. Elena, operating on maternal preservation, forces herself to consume food despite severe physical nausea. Then comes the compliance test of her wardrobe, overdress, and the clinical diagnosis is parasite, underdress, and she signals disrespect. She chooses a structured navy garment, an armor designed to mask vulnerability. The lesson here is profoundly simple. When summoned into a deeply disordered environment, never mirror their pathology. Just armor yourself in your own quiet, unyielding authenticity. Inside the suffocating environment of the vehicle, Elena exhibits visible tremors. Her nervous system is completely overwhelmed. Dante pulls her against his chest, displaying the protective aggression typical of a violent, enmeshed dynamic. He whispers assurances, but beneath her skin, the trauma response is deafening. Dante carries the crushing psychological weight of an apex predator. He warns her that his uncle Roberto extracts narcissistic supply by hunting human frailty. But Dante establishes a lethal boundary. The older sociopath only breathes because Dante permits it. The lesson in this tragic behavioral loop is absolute. You can acknowledge the brutal history that shaped your loved ones, but you must never let those dark ghosts consume the soul you are actively trying to protect. The auditory deprivation inside the approaching vehicle acts as an amplifier for her internal panic. Elena stares blindly at the city, her chest restricted by anxiety. They soon enter Roberto's estate, a fortress built entirely on generational sociopathy. Security personnel march them into a deliberately oppressive library. Towering marble statues look down from the corners, functioning as psychological weapons designed to reduce any visitor to an insignificant speck. The environment itself is engineered to enforce absolute submission. Yet, you must remember this critical life lesson. Never let the sheer scale of a room diminish your internal worth, especially when those massive walls were built solely to hide a terrified and broken man's darkest clinical sins. Stepping into the gloom, we observe Roberto positioned behind a massive desk. The aging narcissist presents as the cruel ghost of a fading regime. His cold effect mimics a mortician dissecting a corpse. Dante introduces them, his vocal tone dropping into a defensive frequency. Elena extends her hand, initiating a standard social contract. Roberto deliberately leaves her hand suspended in the air. This is a calculated act of psychological violence designed to trigger an immediate inferiority complex. But Elena suppresses her panic and roots her posture beside her protector. The clinical takeaway is vital for all of us. When a tyrant attempts to dismantle your fundamental dignity, you do not collapse. You elevate your chin, plant your feet, and refuse to break eye contact. Roberto immediately escalates his psychological assault. His harsh voice cuts through the room, utilizing social paranoia by claiming the entire city is already judging her. He points to 2 chairs intentionally placed lower than his desk, a classic spatial domination tactic. Then, the superficial charm evaporates. Leaning forward, he verbally degrades her as a fragile liability who will drag Dante into an early grave. It is a severe destabilization technique aimed at her core identity. Yet, clinically speaking, there is utility in this overt aggression. The lesson here is quite profound. It is often a psychological blessing when a predator reveals their pathology immediately. Knowing the exact parameters of the monster before you gives you the necessary data to formulate your survival. Before her protector can intervene, Elena executes a brilliant countermeasure. Holding the megalomaniac's gaze, she radically accepts his premise. She clinically admits her total ignorance of his violent family dynamic. For a second, the narcissist experiences cognitive dissonance. Then, Elena softly drives the psychological blade home. She reminds him that his own hand-picked mob bride committed betrayal in Dante's bed. With one factual statement, she dismantles his illusion of control and exposes the systemic rot. Let us analyze this mechanism together. When you voluntarily expose your vulnerabilities to the room, you strip the weapon directly from your abuser's hands. By owning your perceived weakness, you render yourself completely and utterly psychologically untouchable. Beneath the visual plane of the desk, Dante grips her hand. This tactile reinforcement serves as an emotional anchor, transmitting a fierce pride that stabilizes her elevated heart rate. Roberto studies Elena with genuine confusion, processing her as prey that inexplicably developed fangs. He issues a thinly veiled threat, noting that outspoken women in their ecosystem suffer tragic outcomes. But Elena completely rejects the intimidation tactic. Her vocal cords tremble, yet she projects absolute clarity. She states that strong females only threaten fragile, insecure males who require subordinates rather than partners. The lesson here echoes through every traumatic dynamic. Never apologize for the steel in your spine. Authentic respect is forged between equals, not extracted through fear. Operating with clinical cruelty, the aging boss targets her most severe trauma. He weaponizes the memory of her abusive ex-husband anticipating a complete emotional decompensation. Instead, Elena maintains eye contact and deploys radical honesty. She confesses her spirit condition, admitting she once equated love with mere survival. But her affect shifts from victim to survivor. She announces the severing of those trauma bonds. She explains that carrying Dante's offspring is not a calculated manipulation, but the chaotic reality of her healing process. Roberto freezes, his cognitive framework failing to process her resilience. We must internalize this truth. Escaping a toxic nightmare is never a shameful secret. Breaking the cycle of abuse is the ultimate badge of human honor. The narcissist rapidly pivots his strategy, projecting his own transactional nature onto her. He accuses Elena of utilizing her unborn twins as leverage to hijack the familial hierarchy. But Elena refuses to let his paranoid delusions corrupt her genuine attachment. She clearly defies demanding no financial compensation and no false promises. Her singular requirement is Dante's emotional presence as a father. She reminds Roberto she entered his hostile environment entirely aware of his preconceived judgments. The old man fiercely agrees, labeling her a catastrophic liability. The behavioral takeaway is crucial. You must never allow a bitter, emotionally hollow individual to define your reality. You are the sole architect of your internal worth, completely immune to their poison. The toxicity within the space reaches a critical threshold. Roberto is systematically applying psychological pressure, utilizing triggering language to reactivate her complex trauma. Elena physically folds inward, battling the internalized voices that validate this abuse. However, Dante disrupts the cycle. The young boss initiates a lethal shift in baseline behavior. His vocal tone flattens into a chilling calm, the physiological precursor to extreme violence. He issues a direct command for his uncle to cease. When Roberto attempts to reframe his verbal abuse as mere honesty, Dante dissects the manipulation instantly. We must memorize this diagnostic rule. If the partner beside you will not shield you from their family's pathology, the bond is broken. He anchors her hand, rendering her untouchable. Dante establishes an uncompromising behavioral boundary. He categorizes any hostility toward Elena as a direct threat against his genetic line. He presents his uncle with a stark binary choice. The aging narcissist must either submit to this new paradigm or trigger a catastrophic escalation. The implicit threat of violence alters the room's chemistry. Roberto weighs his self-preservation against his pathological ego. He probes Dante, questioning if he would truly dismantle their systemic infrastructure for one female. Dante confirms, without a single micro-expression of doubt, he would happily reduce their dysfunctional empire to ash. True resilience is not an illusion of invulnerability. It is surviving the darkest psychological hell and emerging entirely intact and reborn. Within this highly toxic environment, Dante fully embraces his role as protector. He reminds his uncle that Elena navigated their violent subculture yesterday and endures this psychological interrogation without a single display of weeping. Elena experiences a profound emotional shift, overwhelmed by this fierce display of attachment. Observing this highly enmeshed devotion, the megalomaniac finally ceases his attack. The impenetrable armor of his narcissistic grandiosity fractures, exposing a microdose of genuine validation. He clinically asks Elena what tangible utility she brings to their pathology. The ultimate lesson here is profound. Unwavering loyalty disrupts even the most rigid sociopathic systems. When you fiercely shield your loved ones, even monsters must eventually adapt. you and I are going to unpack a fascinating psychological profile. Watch Elena closely. She constructs her defensive armor with clinical precision, presenting herself to the syndicate as an indispensable asset. She looks directly at Roberto, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, and pledges unwavering loyalty. To a mind like his, loyalty is merely a transaction, so he dismisses her vows. Yet, Elena uses a brilliant counter-manipulation, challenging his paranoia and forcing him to evaluate her future actions. Roberto momentarily yields, though his pathology demands he retain control, threatening to bury her if she fails. It illustrates a fundamental behavioral truth. Verbal negotiations might open a hostile door, but only consistent, observable action guarantees your survival in the room. Her compliance is a textbook survival response. "I understand," Elena murmurs, projecting a flawless exterior while her nervous system triggers a massive adrenaline dump. Roberto dismisses her but detains Dante, an isolating tactic designed to assert absolute dominance. As Elena retreats into the freezing hallway, clinical paranoia sets in. Her mind races, calculating the psychological poison the kingpin is actively feeding Dante. Then, a sudden anomaly disrupts the tension. A heavy oak door swings open, and an elegant woman enters, her warm smile entirely incongruous with the hostile environment. It is a striking observation regarding human endurance. Even when confined within the most toxic, suffocating environments, a sudden intervention from an outside variable can restore your mental baseline. The stranger uses humor to instantly de-escalate the baseline threat level. She gestures at the grim family portraits, joking that Roberto relies on dead men to intimidate his guests. Elena is visibly disoriented by this rapid shift in stimuli. We are then introduced to Chiara, Dante's estranged sister, who has intentionally broken boundaries to analyze Elena herself. Chiara initiates physical contact, linking their arms, and proposing they evacuate the premises immediately. Elena hesitates, her cognitive focus still trapped behind the heavy door with Dante. This displays a core tenet of crisis management. When an active threat completely neutralizes your defensive structures, you must logically accept the first viable extraction route presented, regardless of your lingering emotional attachments. Let us examine how trauma recovery begins. Chiara accurately predicts the behavioral loop the men are stuck in, granting Elena psychological permission to disengage. Elena steps out into the Florence sunlight, distancing herself from the spatial trigger of the syndicate. At a secluded cafe, Chiara prescribes heavily sugared coffee, forcing a rapid glucose spike to counteract Elena's physiological crash. "You just survived a mental war with a monster," Chiara notes, validating the emotional toll. Elena exhales, her rigid defensive structures collapsing as she verbally processes the interrogation. This highlights a necessary mechanisms for long-term cognitive endurance. Stepping entirely away from the active stressor to regulate your nervous system is a vital strategy for sustained survival. Grounding techniques are common in acute anxiety, which we see as Elena tightly grips her porcelain cup. She voices a cognitive distortion, assuming Roberto's hostility stems from her civilian status. Chiara corrects this. The megalomaniac narcissist does not fear her bloodline. He fears her emotional influence. To Roberto, attachment is a structural weakness in his controlled system. Yet, Chiara introduces a pragmatic formula. If Elena demonstrates psychological armor, Roberto will instinctively recalibrate and offer respect. Elena studies Chiara, observing how healthy empathy can somehow develop within a highly sociopathic family unit. The clinical takeaway here is clear. The pathological environment that initially surrounds you does not inherently rewrite your neurological capacity for genuine empathy and human warmth. Elena probes Chiara for the methodology of her escape. The answer relies on absolute behavioral severance. Chiara simply walked away, attaching herself to a low-risk civilian and rejecting the syndicate's resources. Roberto's resulting disownment is framed not as trauma, but as a highly successful psychological boundary. Chiara then exposes a critical data point regarding Dante. He had reached out in the night, exhibiting severe protective anxiety over Elena. For a man conditioned to suppress all vulnerability, this break in protocol is clinically significant. The realization causes a massive somatic release in Elena, her tension dissolving into tears. The psychological lesson is stark. Total severance from a toxic organizational structure is frequently the only viable method to permanently restore your mental equilibrium. The analysis pivots to Elena's central cognitive dissonance. Can a civilian psyche tolerate long-term exposure to an organized crime operative? Chiara refuses to enable denial, confirming the high probability threat of violent retaliation, but she isolates the true variable. Dante's protective drive is absolute. The point of failure is not his capability, but Elena's own stress tolerance. We are observing the early stages of a condition mirroring Stockholm Syndrome, where the subject actively integrates into a dangerous environment to survive alongside their captor. Elena recognizes that her civilian innocence is a liability that must be systematically dismantled. It comes down to a simple, unyielding truth. To operate within a high-stakes power structure, you must adapt to carry its inherent psychological burden. You and I have seen this shift before in high-stress case studies. Elena vocalizes a desire for agency. She actively rejects the passive victim schema, wanting to model a balanced power dynamic. Her primary fear is an internal deficit. She believes she lacks the required resilience. Chiara uses cognitive reframing, directing Elena to analyze her past trauma not as damage, but as inoculation. Surviving a predatory ex-husband and confronting a syndicate boss were extreme stress tests that calloused her psyche. Just as they deconstruct the family pathology, Dante enters. Seeing them together instantly down-regulates his hypervigilant state. It highlights a critical developmental reality. Authentic resilience is never spontaneously generated. It is systematically constructed from every hostile environment you survive. Notice the interpersonal dynamics at play. Chiara embraces her brother, enforcing a strict boundary by labeling Elena as his psychological anchor and warning him not to sabotage the bond. When Dante asks Elena if she is ready to return home, the terminology triggers a powerful cognitive shift. The concept of home has transitioned from an isolated physical space into a relational sanctuary. As they travel through Florence, Elena engages in sensory grounding against the glass. She interacted with an apex predator and maintained her structural integrity. A supportive external variable can profoundly stabilize a spiraling mindset. However, the brain rarely sustains that peace for long. The darkness triggers her anticipatory anxiety, compelling her to ask Dante about the variables Roberto discussed behind closed doors. Dante's disclosure reveals the core conflict. Roberto calculates Elena strictly as an operational vulnerability. Dante countered this by establishing a mutually assured destruction protocol, guaranteeing unprecedented violence if the syndicate threatened her. Now, analyze Elena's reaction through our Stockholm Syndrome framework. The promise of mass casualties should logically trigger a terror response. Instead, It provides her with profound neurological comfort. She has fully adapted to perceive his lethality as a protective mechanism, leaning into his space and rewarding his aggressive posture. When she admits she feels drained but proud, she is acknowledging her cognitive evolution. It is a vital concept set in behavioral modification. Recognizing your own psychological adaptation is a crucial step in cementing a permanent internal shift. Elena logically questions the sustainability of this dynamic, wondering if she faces an indefinite probationary period. Dante maintains clinical honesty. The friction will persist, but he reinforces her positive behavioral data from the day. She exhibited 0 submissive behaviors around a dominant threat. They return to their controlled environment, but the baseline is immediately shattered. A hostile variable has infiltrated the perimeter, her ex-husband, Marco. Marco's presence indicates a severe lack of threat assessment, foolishly stepping into a predator's territory. Elena experiences an acute freeze response as her sanctuary is breached. Beside her, Dante's physiology rapidly shifts into an active combat state. The behavioral takeaway is absolute. A secure mental baseline is incredibly fragile, demanding constant defense against external disruptions. Let us examine the climax of this behavioral arc. Dante's motor functions are primed for lethal action, categorizing Marco strictly as a target. He instructs Elena to withdraw. However, Elena physically intercepts him. Though her micro-expressions reveal fear, her executive function overrides her instinct to flee. She insists on confronting her former abuser. Dante experiences cognitive friction, weighing his primal urge to kill against his respect for her autonomy. He defers to her authority. They find Marco exhibiting classic prey behavior, trapped and physically diminishing himself. Elena observes him without the expected trauma response, maintaining a chilling, clinical focus. The result is profound. When you actively choose to confront a previous source of psychological trauma, you instantly neutralize its capacity to control your nervous system. The atmosphere in the room is heavy with the suffocating weight of a delayed apology. Marco shifts on his feet, his vocal tremors indicating classic fear-based compliance rather than genuine remorse. He spins rationalizations for his past sadism, but Elena observes him with an affect flatter than cold marble. She recognizes his sudden guilt is merely a survival mechanism, triggered only because Dante, the apex predator, nearly terminated his existence. Marco shivers, tracking the syndicate's boss like prey staring at a loaded weapon. You and I have likely reviewed case files like this before. The clinical lesson here is deeply ingrained in human behavior. It often takes a dominant force treating a victim with absolute reverence to force an abuser to recognize the value they foolishly discarded. Elena maintains direct eye contact with the man who systematically dismantled her psyche, yet her autonomic nervous system remains entirely regulated. Marco begs for psychological absolution, demonstrating a profound lack of insight into his own narcissistic abuse. Standing beside a heavily armed protector, Elena exhibits remarkable cognitive restructuring. She realizes she no longer needs her former captor to validate her trauma. She processes his empty apology simply to sever the traumatic bond permanently, clinically evicting his ghost from her mind. It is a fundamental truth of behavioral recovery we must all accept. Genuine forgiveness is never about leaving the psychological door open for your tormentor, but about destroying the locks so you can finally walk away completely free. There is a chilling elegance in observing a survivor dismantle an abuser's psychological grip. Elena revokes Marco's authority, over her cognitive state. Regressing into a hollow shell, Marco stammers a pathetic congratulation regarding the twins. He attempts to counsel Dante, but the boss remains an impenetrable wall of ice. Dante steps close, dropping his tone to a lethal frequency, promising that if Marco ever vocalizes her name again, his respiratory system will fail. Once the coward flees, Dante's terrifying mask dissolves, softening entirely as he checks her emotional baseline. The developmental takeaway here is vital. Recognizing your intrinsic value is the absolute strongest cognitive shield you can forge against those who attempt to diminish your existence. Document this exact behavioral response because her cognitive shift is staggering. There is no manic euphoria, simply a profound cessation of hypervigilance. For years, Marco functioned as an invasive parasite in her psyche, but tonight, those intrusive thoughts have terminated. She leans into Dante's embrace, regulating a breath she unconsciously suppressed for a decade. Tomorrow will drag them back into the sociopathic reality of syndicate politics, but today, she transitions from victim to autonomous survivor. Dante observes her as if she is the singular, stabilizing force in his fractured psychology, quietly proposing dinner. Let us examine this clinical truth together. Severing ties with malignant personalities is the only empirical method to achieve genuine psychological liberation. Dante calls this quiet evening a celebration of her psychological resilience. Elena exhibits an amused micro-expression, aware that his environment is perpetually volatile. In the syndicate, violence is statistically inevitable, but they will navigate the chaos together. Observe this fascinating clinical contradiction. A ruthless crime lord experiencing profound emotional paralysis before an ultrasound monitor. Internally, Elena is undergoing a radical neurological adaptation. The conditioned flinch of the battered victim is completely eradicated. In her place stands an apex survivor, analyzing the architecture of true dominance. Note this therapeutic fundamental. The ultimate retaliation against an abuser is discovering your intrinsic value and choosing rapid growth over stagnant bitterness. Arrives from Milan to condition Elena. In the sociopathic linguistics of the criminal hierarchy, they perform a clinical threat assessment of rival syndicates. Chiara imparts a crucial behavioral strategy. True mastery of manipulation requires knowing when to present a calm effect and when to display lethal aggression. Archaic structures respect blunt force, but reacting to every hostile stimulus will deplete your psychological reserves. Chiara accurately predicts Dante's attachment trauma will soon trigger extreme hypervigilance. By the second trimester, Dante predictably doubles their armed security. Here is a foundational principle of self-preservation. Select conflicts with clinical detachment, because insulating your internal peace is far superior to constantly proving your dominance. Dante's clinical paranoia escalates into a severe pathology, deploying armed operatives across Florence. This isolation fractures Elena's emotional regulation. When he attempts to cancel her exhibition, she outright rejects the gilded confinement. Dante rationalizes his behavior as a basic preservation tactic. She initiates a cognitive intervention, reminding him she survived a decade of psychological torture. Dante makes a critical verbal error, arguing her former abuser was merely a sadist, not an assassin. Elena instantly isolates the misstep. She demands he cease projecting his trauma onto her and treat her as a resilient survivor, not a fragile artifact. Remember this operational standard. A functional partnership requires total psychological transparency, not a prison built on catastrophic fear. Dante's defensive posture collapses under the burden of his empire. He clinically outlines the threat matrix. The predators within his syndicate view Elena as a quantifiable vulnerability. They will target her simply to trigger his mental disintegration. He frames his extreme security as profound desperation, not authoritarian control. Elena absorbs the chilling reality of attaching her survival to a crime lord, yet her nervous system does not overload. Maintaining steady eye contact, she establishes a non-negotiable boundary, refusing to condition their offspring in an environment of perpetual hypervigilance. Dante is rendered mute, his defense mechanisms short-circuited by her resilience. The clinical takeaway is absolute. Never allow the paralyzing anticipation of future trauma to completely eradicate your present autonomy. Dismantling his sociopathic armor, Dante articulates his core trauma. The anticipatory grief of losing her mutated his behavior into tyrannical control. Together, they negotiate a behavioral contract. She will process the syndicate threats rationally, if he stops treating her like a fragile variable. Dante touches her abdomen as fetal movement occurs, noting the biological transfer of their resilience. Elena reminds him that resilience is a survival requirement in his ecosystem. Weeks later, diagnostics confirm the twins are developing optimally. Then, the physician introduces a psychological stressor with a simple inquiry regarding their names. Let us analyze this dynamic. True structural integrity in any partnership is forged through equitable compromise, regardless of the chaotic environment surrounding you. An oppressive silence fills the room. In a criminal dynasty, nomenclature is a geopolitical statement. Elena probes the subject, aware the syndicate expects archaic titles. Dante rejects this conditioning, stating those behavioral expectations can burn. Elena initiates a psychological excavation regarding his father, Alessandro. Dante describes his predecessors as an apex predator whose cognitive architecture collapsed the day his wife expired. He confesses he systematically avoided emotional attachment to prevent anyone from holding the power to annihilate his psyche. But analyzing Elena, he recognizes the neurochemical bond is permanent. Here is a vital diagnostic conclusion. Forming a profound emotional attachment is a calculated risk worth taking, even when it leaves your psychological defenses completely breached. Elena registers an acute physiological stress response. Dante governs an ecosystem where a single variable could terminate their bloodline. He rationalizes constructing an impenetrable physical perimeter. Elena introduces a cognitive reframe, arguing that profound attachment is not a tactical vulnerability. Let us examine this behavioral paradox. Anchoring your consciousness to another human, fully comprehending the catastrophic damage of their loss, is the peak of human resilience. As tension dissipates, Elena proposes the designation Luca, symbolizing light, as a rebellion against his dark lineage. Dante registers approval. Then, maintaining a deadpan affect, he suggests Marco for the second infant. Elena slowly pivots, projecting lethal intent, clinically questioning if he just nominated the exact title of her former abuser. Dante is not triggering her trauma by referencing her abuser. He is citing his grandfather, who instilled a highly advanced philosophy. He conditioned Dante to understand that true dominance is never calculated by blunt trauma, but by the strategic deployment of mercy. Record this clinical fact. Recognizing the moment to de-escalate can preserve your psychological integrity. Elena processes this data and embraces the nomenclature. For a transient phase, the sterile compound exhibits genuine warmth. Hardened operatives experience emotional leakage. However, in this pathological ecosystem, tranquility is merely the latency period before the next traumatic event. 2 nights later, the cognitive illusion shatters entirely. Elena locates Dante pacing the nursery like a cornered apex predator, radiating a terrifying frequency of completely unchecked violence. Let us open this case file and examine the subjects together. We observe Dante, a classic megalomaniacal narcissist, staring at Elena. His facial microexpressions betray a severe internal fragmentation. A phone clatters to the floor, breaking the sterile silence. The intimate medical details of her pregnancy have been leaked to the public. Elena experiences a total cognitive collapse, realizing the betrayal originated from inside their own secure perimeter. Dante is paralyzed by a narcissistic rage so profound it completely overrides his executive function. He grips her shoulders, a desperate attempt to maintain control over his primary psychological anchor. We must understand a fundamental truth here. Once a secret leaves your mouth, it belongs entirely to the wind. The environmental stimuli shift drastically, plunging Dante into a severe depressive episode. His pathology cannot process the failure to maintain his omnipotent control over Elena. She, displaying textbook signs of Stockholm Syndrome, draws her captor close. She rationalizes his failure to protect her privacy, actively soothing the very architect of her isolation. By morning, the villa is surrounded by external threats in the form of media parasites. The tabloids trigger Dante by comparing her to his previous victims. He demands she retreat into complete isolation until the threat neutralizes. There is a clinical wisdom we can all apply here. Stepping back into a quiet space, rather than engaging in every senseless conflict, is the most effective way to protect your mental baseline. Elena accepts the physical confinement, yet we see a fascinating psychological resistance form within her. She refuses to internalize the shame Dante's lifestyle forces upon her. Meanwhile, Dante undergoes a terrifying behavioral regression, driven by a megalomaniacal need to restore his perceived absolute power. He deploys his syndicate. Within 48 hours, the informant is extracted. It is Alessia, the romantic partner of his associate Marco. The psychological shock of this betrayal is immense. You must aggressively monitor your inner circle, because allowing a malignant personality into your proximity will inevitably destroy your foundation. Elena watches this cold treason unfold. She looks at her captor and quietly asks what punishment awaits a woman who defies a clinical sociopath. Dante's vocal tone flattens into a chilling, emotionless register, a hallmark of severe antisocial personality disorder. He outlines a calculated campaign of total psychological and physical erasure against Alessia. He will systematically dismantle her existence until she is nothing but a ghost. Elena displays irrational empathy, mourning for Marco, completely unaware of the threat he brought into their environment. Dante, however, exhibits zero effective empathy. Marco made his choice, so he will share in the systematic ruin. We find a stark reality in this behavior. The individuals you choose to align with will ultimately determine your survival or your destruction. Elena shivers at his detached cruelty, yet her Stockholm Syndrome convinces her this monster is her only true protector. The acute crisis phase stabilizes into quiet endurance. The external media fixation fades, allowing Elena to re-enter normal spaces. Now at 30 weeks pregnant, her primary conflict is entirely somatic. The gestational burden of twins pushes her physical limits to the edge. She presents as a fractured psychological vessel, yet Dante projects his own narcissistic grandiosity onto her. He frames her as a living monument to his genetic legacy. This dynamic offers a healthy behavioral model. We must consistently validate our partners during their darkest psychological states, as one positive reinforcement can alter their entire emotional trajectory. Medical confirmation of the twins' health solidifies their shared delusion of absolute victory. We observe Elena in a state of severe physiological depletion. Her attempts to mask the exhaustion fail, pulling her into extended periods of lethargy. This fragile stasis is ruptured when Kiara invades their perimeter, presenting with acute panic. Kiara delivers an existential threat to the family unit. Their patriarch, Roberto, has initiated a hostile organizational maneuver. This older sociopath claims Dante's pathological obsession with Elena is degrading their operational efficiency. He intends to use the unborn twins as leverage to strip Dante of his authority. Never forget this clinical reality. The most lethal threats often originate from within your own family system. Kiara confirms Dante is rapidly escalating to a war footing, preparing to permanently eliminate his uncle. Let us analyze this critical turning point together. As the cognitive dissonance fades, Elena's fear transitions into a highly focused, aggressive state. Roberto's strategy relies on textbook psychological manipulation. He intends to replace Elena with a compliant asset, reducing her to a discarded variable while stealing her offspring. Kiara displays visible somatic distress over this betrayal. Elena's sympathetic nervous system fully activates, demanding to know Dante's location. Kiara admits Dante is preparing to confront the entire syndicate alone. A crushing wave of irrational guilt paralyzes Elena as she questions if her presence is the catalyst for his destruction. The clinical takeaway here is absolute. A functional partnership never allows one person to absorb a catastrophic threat alone. Pay close attention to this behavioral pivot. Elena breaches his secure study. Dante presents with the freezing, predatory affect required of an apex criminal. Yet, the moment he establishes visual contact, his rigid defenses dissolve. He issues a directive for her to rest, but she refuses. Looking directly at this predator, she poses a critical diagnostic question. If maintaining their bond requires the total destruction of his empire, would he proceed? Dante exhibits zero hesitation. He confirms he would systematically dismantle his own bloodline to secure her safety. We must recognize a profound truth here. True strength is not systemic control over others. It is the terrifying capacity to sacrifice your entire established world to protect your deepest human attachment. Dante initiates physical contact, framing her face to ensure total psychological focus. His vocal modulation shifts lower, indicating a transition to offensive calculation. He verbalizes a complete rejection of his familial conditioning, refusing to operate within their toxic behavioral loops. Elena maintains intense eye contact, ordering him to permanently neutralize Roberto. She enforces a strict boundary, refusing to expose their offspring to his volatile environment without the symbolic binding of marriage. Dante displays a micro-expression of dark amusement. He interprets her ultimatum as a high-stakes behavioral challenge. Remember this mechanism. You must establish rigid, uncompromising boundaries if you ever expect to reshape a chaotic environment into a stable, functional reality. You and I must look at the timeline of this crisis. Dante vows their formal union will serve as the final strike against Roberto before confronting the syndicate. Back in the secure perimeter, Elena experiences acute hypervigilance. She paces the environment, exhibiting severe startle responses to minor stimuli. At midnight, Dante returns. His physical presentation indicates severe trauma and exhaustion, yet he displays the triumphant effect of a successful predator. He completely neutralized the internal threat while maintaining absolute control. Never forget this principle. The most disruptive, powerful action an individual can take is prioritizing an authentic emotional bond over a rigid system built on fear and intimidation. The megalomaniac has reasserted dominance. Dante systematically stripped Roberto of his institutional power, establishing a behavioral baseline where any further deviation results in permanent erasure. He exhibits physical collapse, pulling Elena into his personal space to regulate his shattered nervous system. Chiara quietly observes this enmeshment before withdrawing. Left in isolation, Dante engages in protective tactile behaviors toward the unborn twins, attempting to sever the intergenerational trauma of his lineage. Profound loyalty is only ever forged when individuals survive severe psychological distress together. She questions his logic in binding his empire to a perceived vulnerability. He counters that surviving his family proves she is a highly resilient, equal organism. Let us close this file by examining their final commitment phase. With the gestational period ending, Elena seeks to formalize their unit before the environment destabilizes again. Dante, however, preempts her psychological need for security. He does not offer a normalized, low-stress existence. Instead, he demands she integrate fully into his high-risk pathology as an equal participant. This radical display of trust triggers a massive emotional release, a terrifying culmination of her Stockholm syndrome. She agrees to bind her psychological survival to a dangerous individual, but taking a massive behavioral leap into the unknown can be adaptive when you trust the person catching you. Weeks later, they finalize the bond in isolation, surrounded only by absolute, verifiable loyalty. We observe a scene painted in shadows and golden Tuscan light. Roberto projects an untouchable calm, while the focus shifts to Elena. She glows, bearing the beautiful burden of a 33-week pregnancy. Dante stands across the room, utterly captivated. He stares at her like a starving man finding salvation. They whisper their vows, surrounded by hardened enforcers who silently legitimize this trauma bond. Dante leans close, asking if she is ready, and, on cue, the twins kick. At 35 weeks, the waiting shatters. Dante shifts in an instant. The warmth drains away, replaced by the icy, psychopathic focus of a boss, driving her through the night with flawless precision. It leaves us with a stark truth. The most powerful people stay perfectly steady when the script burns to ashes. Let us flash forward to the clinical aftermath. Luca breaches the world first, screaming with distress. Soon after, Marco emerges with a cold, calculating gaze. We can already predict the developmental trauma. One day, we will analyze Luca's pain through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome, watching him idolize the very syndicate that isolates him. But tonight, observe Dante. This ruthless architect of suffering is experiencing severe autonomic tremors. The terrifying weight of biological creation has completely destabilized him. Sustaining an infant is true existential terror, yet his lethal hierarchy immediately adapts into a soft familial support structure. It proves a universal truth. Whether you manage a dark empire or just navigate daily survival, you absolutely cannot endure the hardest nights without a fiercely loyal network holding up the walls. Let's open this case file together. 3 months of suspended animation. The pathological gears of syndicate violence pause. Replaced by the clinical quiet of a nursery, we observe the twins. Luca exhibits a demanding presence, while Marco remains motionless, Mirroring his father, Dante's predatory stare, Elena watches them, hypervigilant. Dante emerges from the shadows, probing her psyche. Does she regret integrating her identity into a lethal criminal organism? Zero micro-expressions of doubt. Roberto's prior betrayal did not fracture her ego. It calcified her defenses into iron. You and I have seen this trauma response before. When the environment attempts to bury a subject, that acute pressure often becomes the exact catalyst required to actualize their most dangerous potential. Elena clinically evaluates the apex predator who controls the city. She strips away her psychological armor, articulating a profound vulnerability. She admits that loving a megalomaniac leaves her critically exposed. Losing this family unit would reduce her psyche to ash. Yet she leans into the cortisol spike, whispering that ambient terror simulates vitality. Dante pulls her close. He asserts that true dominance is not emotional necrosis. Empathy is the ultimate leverage. 6 months later, Elena operates her fine art gallery in Florence. Dante arrives from a syndicate negotiation, his dark suit imposing. The clinical takeaway is elemental. The highest stakes maneuver a subject can execute is securing the flank of a partner, actively constructing an empire. We track Dante navigating the civilian gallery patrons. His predatory aura cuts a deliberate path to his fixation. He leans in, murmuring that her creation is a masterpiece. Elena maintains in steady eye contact, reinforcing their shared control. She insists they fabricated this reality in tandem, noting he validated her existence when she had nothing. Later, with the twins guarded, they patrol the moonlit cobblestones of Florence. Elena triggers a flashback to their collision 4 years prior. She was lecturing an unidentified male on the cognitive illusion of choice, failing to profile the quiet observer as a lethal syndicate boss. It is a fascinating behavioral anomaly. You never truly calculate when a random passing conversation will permanently rewrite your neural pathways and alter your destiny. The street lamp illuminates a micro-expression of dark amusement on Dante's face. He initiates a stress test. Would her primitive flight response have activated if she knew he had fresh blood on his hands that afternoon? Elena clinically admits her former fragile self would have evacuated immediately. Let us examine this psychological mutation together. She evaluates the severe trauma that dismantled her previous identity, categorizing it as a necessary thermal event. Complete ego death was the prerequisite to reconstruct her into a dominant threat. Reflected in the dark river, she whispers gratitude for the scars. Every brutal hit maneuvered them to this stabilization. We must all process this clinical reality. Sometimes, the only bedrock dense enough to support an impenetrable fortress is rock bottom itself. Elena profiles the syndicate Don functioned as a barrier against the elements demanding her termination. When the criminal hierarchy pressured him to sever the attachment, his fixation chose her. Dante holds her gaze, his vocal register dropping, and verbalizes his love. Elena mirrors the sentiment. She classifies him as a rigid megalomaniac, yet acknowledges their complementary pathologies. Their psychological profiles interlock perfectly. Hand in hand, they navigate the ancient masonry. They know the dopamine spike will fade by dawn. The infant Luca is teething, and the gallery requires logistical oversight. Analyze any stabilized bond, and you find this baseline truth. When the adrenaline dissipates, the daily operational labor of maintaining your empire is completely mandatory. The camera frames the subjects against the architecture. Dante faces hostile syndicate negotiations at daybreak, but tonight their neurochemistry registers victory. They isolated the variable Elena sought in classical art. Profound beauty materializes only after prolonged exposure to systemic terror. The terrified civilian she once was is eradicated. A formidable operator occupies her place. She learned that hiding behind a violent narcissist is a fatal vulnerability. Genuine self-preservation requires autonomous strength. Their alliance functions because they operate as equals, refusing to cage one another. Document this variable. A legendary life is never synthesized from a sanitized environment. It requires collecting the fractured shards of your psyche and weaponizing your trauma into an unbreakable blade. The feed transitions over Florence, isolating the twins behind a perimeter of armed guards. Clinical clarity registers in Elena's mind. A secure baseline is not a coordinate, but the operatives willing to stand with you in the void. This is the genesis of a new behavioral cycle. Whatever pathological vendettas the underworld manufactures next, she is not an isolated target. She, Yanit, is tethered to a man who calculated her value when society deemed her defective. They are conditioning their offspring to metabolize extreme fire. You and I analyze these environments daily. Reality is designed to fracture your sanity. But if you possess the audacity to prioritize fierce attachment over biological fear, you manipulate the entire paradigm. That is the only valid metric of success. The screen fades to black. Another powerful lesson from the story is about surviving abuse public judgment. After Dante publicly claims Elena and the pregnancy, so private life becomes gossip. Strangers online judge her body, her past, her motives, and her worth. They call her a nobody, accuse her of trapping Dante, and compare her to an image they invented. This reflects a harsh reality of modern life. People often feel entitled to comment on someone else's story without knowing the truth. For a YouTube audience, this lesson is especially relevant because online judgment can spread quickly and cruelly. Elena's experience teaches that public opinion is often shallow, incomplete, and shaped by insecurity. The crowd that watched Marco humiliate her did not know her years of pain. The commenters did not know her kindness, her intelligence, or her courage. They saw one dramatic moment and created a story around it. Dante's response is important because he reminds Elena that strangers' opinions do not define her. But the deeper lesson is that Elena must learn this for herself. External validation can comfort us, but inner strength must eventually come from within. The world may gossip, misunderstand, or judge, but a person still has the right to live truthfully. Elena cannot control every rumor, but she can control whether she allows those rumors to shrink her. Her story encourages viewers to be careful with the way they judge others, especially online. Behind every viral moment is a human being with history, pain, and dignity. The educational message is clear. Do not let public noise decide your identity. A meaningful future is built not by pleasing strangers, but by choosing relationships, work, and family structures that honor your true worth. Elena's story begins with humiliation, but it turns toward hope because she stops letting other people write her value for her.